Hi, I'm Darach O'Séaghdha, author of Mother Folklore, Dispatches from Not So Dead Language. Welcome to the Courage Literary Festival, coming from Ashford Castle. Today we're going to be talking about English, Irish, and the space between Hiberno-English. It's something I'd like to get back to the bottom of. It's something I've talked about in my writing. It's something that's addressed in the writings of my guests today, Lisa McInerney and Manchán Magan. Welcome to Courage.
Thank you so much, Darach.
So, when we talk about English, the English language, and we talk about the Irish language, there's often an idea that there's the study of both assumes a kind of a certain purity is possible that doesn't exist in the way anyone speaks either language. Lisa, when you write in your novels, the Glorious Heresies of course being your debut, you don't just write. You've written in Hiberno-English. Your characters speak Hiberno-English. What they speak is what's local is kind of universal.
Yeah, I mean that was really important to me. The idea of, and I think it's a strange thing because I probably grew up reading, as a lot of Irish kids did grow up reading, very stiff kind of British, very proper British children's books like the likes of Enid Blyton and stuff like this. And so I think for a long time in my head, the idea of proper writing, certainly when I was young, was that kind of very, again, stiff, kind of very proper, kind of very English, not much kind of local flavour. And it didn't really correspond with how I spoke at home or how my family spoke or how my granddad would tell us stories or anything like that. So when I started writing more seriously for myself, so this would have been in my teens, that's when I started thinking, hold on now, this isn't quite real. This kind of the English that I guess I as well probably learning at school, you know, because you were learning grammatically correct English and all of this, and you're learning about the nuts and bolts of the English language. This didn't feel quite real to me. This didn't feel right. And around that time as well, I would have started reading more adult fiction, and by that I mean the likes of suddenly Roddy Doyle, who kind of opened everything up for me, and I went, oh my God, you totally can write the way Irish people speak. You totally can capture those patterns, that rhythm, and still make it good writing and still make it beautiful. And then of course he won the Booker, which was very helpful for this burgeoning hypothesis that I had in my head. Pat McCabe was the other one when I was a teenager, this person who was writing in English but playing with it, because of course at that age I wasn't exactly old enough to have read Ulysses. I didn't realize that we had this kind of long tradition of being very playful with the English language. It would have been just Enid Blyton and then suddenly Roddy Doyle, a bit of a jump.
That's quite a jump. Manchán, do you find when you in your own work that the Irish language is like bubbling underneath the kind of the icy surface of English as spoken in Ireland? That it's like lumpy paste underneath the wallpaper of the English language.
Yeah, as you say, like so we don't stop to think of it, but there is this discomfort when you have two languages, and particularly when you know that one language is culturally weighted compared to the other. So. Like it's a great point about Joyce, obviously having no compunction, having this total international view and realizing let's glorify in our own natural speech. But it wasn't a natural thing. Like you take Kavanagh, despite his talk about, you know, his like the what is it, the wink and nudge language of delight, the thick-tongued mumble. You know, he was aware that his Monaghan English wasn't something to be proud of, but was also. For example, you won't find Hiberno-English in his poems. At least I haven't seen any. It took Heaney. Who said he was so inspired by Kavanagh. And Kavanagh loads his poems with place names, realizing the melody is in the place names, you know. But yet it was a step too far to realize that, like, their words, like, you know, his childhood, he wouldn't have said I'm looking for something. He would have said I'm cuardach. Who's cuthering for something there from a cuardach? Or like. Oh, I'll do that now that the gyudum is in me. Now that from gyudum, from like a spark or an urge or an agitation is in me. But you won't find those in his poems. Whereas then you go on Heaney, who goes along saying, because of Kavanagh saying you could write from the stony soil, he was able to use all of those words from Balahi, from Anorish. And you know, just think there's Dove, I can think of Cladach, Dillisk in his poems. I wrote a few others down. Footit, Flagger, far, glar, maidan, mara, pamputis. He knows he can get that it's kind of cool and sexy to drop in a bit of his own street slang. But actually, it's a psychologically worrying thing to do when you don't feel confident about where we come from. And that was so strong with us. Until the 18th century, Irish was the language we naturally spoke. And then 1831, that Schools Act, the English imposed English on us. And suddenly it was very clear that there was a big difference between the two. And, when I was growing up, the only person who was pointing this out to me was Diarmuid O'Mahila in the Irish Times. He had, something the fuckle. It'll come to me now. He had a little column anyway of odd words, and he then collected a book of all his Hiberno words. But he was inspired by a man in the 70s, a professor from UCG at the time, from NUIG, who he gave this example of a Connemara man, and the Connemara goes, drink what's that in your noggin, you bockach, and you'll get more while ago when you'll drink what's that. Which for him was perfect English because it was just he was in those two languages. But again, along comes us laughing at it, or seeing before and totally laughing at it. So yeah, it's both are there, and it's very complex about how we're going to use them.
Lisa, when you've written about Cork slang specifically, or as well as Galway slang when it happens in characters, I mean, it's like there's some of it can be traced to Irish, but some of it is just the local language of a city, of a kind of an inclusion and an exclusion that happens with local slang.
Yeah, I mean, it's a totally different thing. Again, I think the slang stuff, and particularly when it comes to translation, because I've been translated a few times now, and one of the things that kind of comes through, a lot of people ask me, well, when you're writing, you've got so many Cork words there now. It must be hilarious when your translators are onto you and they're asking you things like, well, what does haunted mean? Haunted being a very Cork term, meaning specifically you were very lucky. It doesn't mean you're followed around by a ghost at all. And this is not something I'd ever learned when I was growing up in Galway. But that isn't the actual problem at all, because slang is usually, it's not kind of rooted in something so Irish that it has to be kind of taken apart and kind of, for a lot of my translators, it was like, I found that very quickly. It's an Urban Dictionary online. It's not something that we had to dig into at all. That wasn't the problem for them. Slang they found very simple. The problem for them was more the structure and kind of more deeper. Well, what does that mean? Because you seem to have said something else, but I feel like that's not what you meant. So because I grew up in Galway and then I moved down to Cork, so that's why the accent is a mix of the two. And when I moved down to Cork first, one of the things that really jumped out at me was the slang and the different ways of saying very similar things, the madly different kind of verbs that were happening, all within the language. Like, it was still completely understandable to me. But it was a case of like getting this electric shock and going, oh, that is so cool. Like, we don't say that up in Galway at all. And the other thing is, I think when you grow up somewhere, you don't necessarily hear whether it's slang, whether it's Irish loan words, whether it's a certain syntax, you don't necessarily hear it because that's normal. But when you go to another part of Ireland and you hear these kind of delicious differences, it becomes very, very exciting. So one of the things that really hammered home kind of all the Corkonian slang to me, which kind of found its way into the novels I was writing, I was working in construction down in Cork. I was actually just in the office. I wasn't, out on the sites or anything like that. That would be a wonderful kind of education. And one of the gentlemen that I used to work with, who was a sales rep, Declan, he had the most encyclopedic knowledge of Cork slang. And because I hadn't been born in Cork, he would take great delight in telling me all these things. And he'd come into me and he'd say, girl, do you know what a 50 is? I'd say, I don't, Declan, what's a 50? He says, a 50 is like when you get stood up on a date. I says, oh, really? Is that the... He says, yeah, because only 50% show up the date and stuff like that. So he would, and because of all of these things, because they were new to my ear, I remembered them. And I used to thread them through my own language, and I used to come back to Galway and just be unintelligible to people up there. And when I started writing The Glorious Heresies, The Blood Miracles and The Rules of Revelation, that was the language that the characters spoke in. Yeah.
Absolutely, and even new to your ear is a little bit Irish too. Now, I found that I remember my mother's from Ballinlough in Cork, and I found when I went down there was almost a willful refusal to use terms that are popular in Dublin.
Oh, yeah,
and particularly that they like not having a debs, having grads instead of debs at the end of at the final dance at the end of school, and refusing to say. And Yeah, and then having different terms for other things like that, like the way that the normal terminology you'd have at a chipper at the end of the night, where they wouldn't actually refer to something as a whirly-burger, they had a different name for it in Cork.
Slang can be very political, like.
Highly political. Just like the big debate about where a spice bag was invented in Ireland.
Yeah.
So it's still highly contested.
I'd only heard of spice bags very recently, I have to say, like that. I figured they're an East Coast thing. Am I wrong?
Well, I just assumed they were created in Dublin because, you know, everything great comes from Dublin at some point. But sure, apparently they originated in Carlow. Some poor soul has decided to do their thesis in collecting takeaway menus over the past 30 years.
Wow, it's Carlo's gift to the world.
We don't know that yet. I can't confirm that. Before anyone attacks me online, it has been suggested that they originated in Carlow. So there.
But that pride you get when you resound with something that comes from your home place. And like I was brought up in Donnybrook, so there's nothing I can boast on. There's no culture, there's no great nugget I can give except seeing, you know, one dilly wagon going down to RTÉ. But what I do get is the Irish language. When I hear that West Kerry Irish will immediately relax me, you know. And if I hear another, in fact, like if I hear on Radio na Gaeltachta, and every dialect does this, we turn off the Connemara dialect, we turn off the Donegal dialect because we're from West Kerry. And in fact, in 2006, I did a TV series, No Berla, and we put that to the test. The psychological aspect of the feeling of relaxation and goodness you feel when you hear your own local sort of vernacular language as opposed to the other. So we got people from Donegal to listen to an hour of West Kerry, of Gael and Corcagina, and then we gave them an IQ test before and after, and then we went down to Kerry and we got people to listen to an hour of Ronan McAvey of Donegal, and they dropped their IQ significantly after that hour, significantly. Now this was us doing an IQ, it wasn't the most like laboratory scientific thing, but like what happens is when you hear your own language, you just relax, you're at home. And it's just like when you go to your French exchange, you know, when you're a kid and you're really good for the first 10 minutes concentrating, and then your brain has to think more to understand, and it's just exhausting. So your brain function drops after a time. So it just, the minute we hear our own people, it relaxes us, you know. It makes sense why we'd have dialects and why we'd have vernaculars.
Yeah. You just brought back though kind of to me the absolute panic you'd feel in the Leaving Cert getting the wrong dialect on the oral test. It's like, oh God, it's Ulster Irish. What are we going to do? Just panic, we've all failed.
This is the thing, and I find when I talk to people from Donegal, they say that the Donegal Irish and the oral tapes is extremely slow compared to how it's actually spoken.
Right.
And respect. Yeah, that's the thing. But I know it is a thrill to kind of know that, say, something, that a particular phrase, something originates from your area, but that possibly has led to some erroneous word origins being promulgated. Like, but such as, I mean, I think there was a theory of going wild that the Irish language created the word jazz and such nonsense, and that's and 20 years on after those first, people still suggest it, or that saying that you dig something comes from undigging too.
Oh, yeah. I was really hoping that wasn't apocryphal because it's so lovely. The idea that all these cool people in America were saying like you dig because they'd heard digging too. I mean, I loved it. I mean, it's too perfect though, isn't it? It
is, and I think as writers we appreciate a good pun.
And there are some of them. They're not as exciting as dig or jilt. For jiltig could be definitely, we know the galore and all those ones, the sort of obvious ones, slua. But bully for builla, I would vouch is true. But then was that bloody one man in New York, wasn't he? He just took every single word in English and decided it was an Irish root.
I think he went through the dictionary, found whatever origin unknown, and said, "Well, that's definitely Irish then."
Sounds like something we do.
Yeah, well, it's chancellorish, but it just shows how I suppose it just shows how a story like that can, when people want to believe it, it's they will do. But if people only believe something because they want to, then chances are it's probably not true. So it's you mentioned Heaney there, and I was just thinking about, like, last year there was a huge amount of attention into an extract from one of Heaney's plays, which was about the line about hope and history rhyming, which was made very popular in the presidential campaign. And it was just very interesting. I found that, like that, what didn't get much discussion was, in Irish, hope and history can rhyme. We have docus and ducus, or being rhythm in the docus is ducus. And And this is probably something, and we don't know how much of that was, again, it's something we want to believe as a private joke, or if it's just something that was cleverly interpreted after the fact. But I mean, this is in a lot in Heaney and in other modern poets, there's the idea is the Irish language is bubbling under the surface. Well, Kavanagh did avoid using Hiberno-English specifically. Something that has happened more in a decade since is that Hiberno-English is like an instrument of what makes the poetry here distinctive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it actually had a practical use. Like the reason that all of these words, that like a saunachan, which is like it's sometimes called a slob trout. It's a salmon or a trout who has decided to go out and spawn. No, he's left the river to go out and decide to go out to spawn, but then gets to the estuary and decides no, he's not going to go any further, and just hangs out there for the rest of his life. So it has never made love, basically, and there's no English word for it. But for a fisherman, it's very important because they have a different way of moving in the water. They have a different taste, and so if the English language doesn't have a word, you had to keep the word that was in the Irish language. And because can you call Irish an indigenous language? Any very old native language has all of those words for people who were basically being sustained by the landscape. So you have a word like saunachan, you have a word like cronine, which is the first run of the salmon, of the autumn salmon, these small salmon, or you have a word like angara, which is a salmon after spawning, and then you have that word, that lovely word I have in my book, seher, which means a lot of things, as you know, but one is the hole that the salmon digs, or a trout digs in the gravel to drop its eggs in. There's no words in those in English, just because, I don't know, maybe English came along with more farming where we didn't actually need to have to depend on the natural world. We could control it a bit more. So that's what we lose.
That is, yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's the other thing is, like, there are equivalent words for these that I'm going to come up with now in English, but sometimes it just feels more right to say the Irish. Like for me, it would be more natural to say re-raw. It would be more natural for me to say something like raw-maish, or something like yaploika, all of these kind of things, or plawmoss. And I know you can use a word like weedle for plawmoss, but it's not the same. There's a cunning behind the word plawmoss that just doesn't exist. When I say plawmoss, that's what I mean. So that in itself, I mean, sometimes there is the other word exists, but it's just not, it's not the right one. It's not the heart word. It's not the soul word that you want.
Absolutely not. Now, plawmoss is a great example of a word that just hasn't been replaced because it can't be replaced because there's too much knowledge in there, just like Shleveen. And that a Shleveen is different from just a trickster. It's a very specific kind of, a particular kind of cunning, of someone coming down from the mountain,
Well, it's funny, like every one of our generations would have had a different store. So our grandparents probably would have had all our words that the parents had and the words that we have, the raw-maish and the re-raw. But they drain out. And so the generation that are coming after us, so like we would have had, we have probably had kesh, because long kesh, so we know it's something like a bridge. Crewbean, we still definitely have crewbean. In Cork we have drisheen, we understand what, but the next gen kids, they won't know what drisheen is. Crewbean might last one more generation. When it's like Quainach for moss, gone. Bundoon for a bum. In some parts, I heard in Roscommon, Westmeath, but it's like every 10 years, some of these go. Buller for watercress, so we'll get some buller in the stream. They're going. I don't know. They're not being replaced. Yeah,
that's what the next thing I was going to say is, like, the worry is that they're not being replaced by anything else, and this is the thing, because I think there's a book that I just finished reading at the moment, and it's by Lisa Barrett. She's a Canadian writer about, she's a scientist and she writes about neuroscience, and one of her book was How Emotions Are Made, or something like that. I hope I've got the title right. But one of the things she was saying is that we need language in order to form emotions. This is her hypothesis. And in order for us to kind of have a shared idea of what an emotion is, we need a word for it, so that there is a huge connection between language and what we perceive to be common emotions, and how we feel and how we talk about that. So when you start losing words for things, you lose the feeling as well, I think, or you lose that something very special, and that really kind of worries me. So we need the young people of Ireland to go out there and coin some new neologisms in Irish for the rest of us.
That's definitely a thing. I know when people talk about how certain senses have more power. The way saying, I see, meaning yes, I understand very well, but I hear you, meaning I know what you mean, but I disagree with you. How these things are implied. Now I smell you, it does mean something completely different. But yeah, the idea is certain things are highly sensory, and you get this, and these are things that don't translate directly. The idea of saying the difference between I see and I hear you being something that's isn't entirely replicated. But the idea that a loss of words meaning is a loss of knowledge, or that one follows that there's a chicken and the egg there, in that maybe the loss of some words is linked to the fact that people aren't actually catching their own fish and tending to their own animals, who they will mind and then they will eat, and that these connections are lost now because some of us just removed from an agricultural society.
And I know that language does evolve and change, and that we can't kind of set, language is a living thing, you don't set it in stone, and you can't just rely on this standard to live forever. That purity idea that you were talking about earlier. But still it feels like something that I'm like, once it's gone, and that's kind of an alarming thing to think about.
So, Lisa, when your books were translated into Italian, German, Czech, how did they reconcile the fact that your book is in English and some of these words are specifically in different languages? You actually have a passage, I believe, which you were going to. I'm not sure if it refers to the translation process or not, but
it doesn't.
Okay.
But we can talk about that. But I do have a passage. I can read that first if you like.
That'd be great.
But it's from the new book, so this is the Rules of Revelation. This hasn't been translated yet.
Okay.
But it will be. So I'm already preparing, kind of like, what am I going to be asked? Because I'm often very wrong about what I'm going to be asked about in when we talk about translation. But I can read a bit.
That'll give us an example of what we can all imagine what a translator is faced with.
Yeah, exactly. So the bit that I'm going to read, the character in it is Maureen. She's 68. She's Cork born and bred, but she spent many years in London. But she's a Cork woman, of course. And what has happened is she's met 3 German tourists in Cork city centre, and they've lost their tour guide, so they're at a loose end, and she's decided she's going to step in and she's going to help them out. So I'll read that and we'll see how we get on. She led the ones to the Butter Museum and the Firkin Crane and recounted what she remembered about Cork's dairy industry, which wasn't much. So she told them instead about a recent case involving an Irish butter smuggling ring in Wisconsin. The name of the butter involved was Kerrygold, but she didn't want to confuse the Germans by invoking the neighbours. Cork butter, she told them, was the best in the world. The social welfare, she said, used to give out butter vouchers. That's how important butter was. The elderly, the infirm, the layabouts all got subsidised butter, God be with the days. They stopped at Griffith Bridge and Maureen looked back towards Shandon, hands on her hips. I'd say there's not much else on the north side for you. She thought hard. The old jail is out Sunday as well. Yes, said the one on the right. We visited on Wednesday. My mother was from Sunday as well. They have waxworks in that jail, and I swear to God, 2 or 3 of them are the head off her. She looked like them, clarified the one in the middle. She was an old bitch, Maureen said, with a face like a half-chewed toffee. Like a half-chewed toffee? And the toffee you get in Ireland would glue your jaw shut, Maureen said, staring. She recovered and waved an arm. That's the north side now. Less about places of interest, more about people of interest. 10 minutes up there and you'll come to the North Mon, where all the great lads went to school. Terence McSweeney and Frank O'Connor and Neil Tobin and our own Taoiseach Jack Lynch and Rory Gallagher, God rest their souls. I've read Frank O'Connor's stories, said the one on the right. I haven't, Maureen said. Cork is a very male place. But then I suppose, isn't that the way of history? It's all feckin' men. Here now they're proud of Roy Keane, oh, fine Northside boy, and Cillian Murphy, and Jonathan Bryce, what's his name, and Dennis Irwin, and the little fecker off Game of Thrones. Jesus is the only woman we had, Daniel feckin' Rue. These are celebrities, the one in the middle said. Well, insofar as they can be around here. Come down now this way, I want to show you something. They walked westwards along a disquietingly high lea. Maureen stopped at the footbridge at the end of the quay. This is St. Vincent's Bridge. 2 of the ones took photographs through the lattice steel. And there, Maureen pointed, is where I used to live. A ground floor flat in a done-up townhouse. Though you wouldn't know that now because it went up in flames a few years back. I was only in it when I found out it used to be a brothel. How long ago? One of the ones asked. Maureen was looking too intently at her old home to identify the speaker. Was it a brothel? Just before I moved in. It's illegal in Ireland. Brothel keeping is, said Maureen, who had done her research and considered herself better informed than the average nana. But didn't I tell you? This is a fierce male city. Fierce meaning violent? Fierce meaning very. We leave it at that.
Absolutely brilliant. Can't wait to get my hands on that book. Fierce meaning very.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
But this is the kind of thing that I love though about Hiberno-English, and it's those little things. So it's not necessarily slang, it's just this kind of weird way that we have of underlining things or emphasizing things, fierce being one of them. And the linguist and editor Stan Carey wrote in the Galway issue, The Stinging Fly, which I admit I edited last year. He wrote a really brilliant essay about Hiberno-English. And one of the things he said that you know, it's one of those things that you always know and you just need somebody to say it. And he points out things like in Hiberno-English you can say fierce gentle or pure filth. And they make no actual sense in traditional English. In your British English, they're contradictory. But these kind of things I like. So that's the kind of little knot I think that the translators have great fun unpicking more than anything else, you know.
Because the idea of the double meaning of fierce is right there in the actual thing. So they have to find an equivalent term in Czech to match that energy somehow, or they might have to actually renegotiate the entire passage in some way.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, the issue isn't, because translation it's more than, it's not a kind of a direct thing. It's more like a conversation. It's a kind of a magic. So it's not a case of just I have to I have to make this sentence again from the ground up. I have to make it match exactly the sentence in Hiberno-English. That's not it. You kind of have to capture the rhythm of it and the soul of it. And there may actually be a pun in there, or there may be a bit of playfulness in there that has to be found. So that's the great fun, I think. Certainly in speaking to my translators, that's the kind of great fun that they have with it. And sometimes that means potentially playing with a dialect within that language. Or so my Czech translator, Teresa, she translated both of my novels into Czech, and the second one, The Blood Miracles, the character in it is Ryan. He's 20 going on 21 at the time, so he's about a little Scot, is what we'd say in Ireland. And for her to kind of capture the way he spoke, because obviously if she translated it directly, it just wouldn't sound right to a Czech ear. They'd be like, I don't understand what's going on here. This is in English, but it's very awkward and weird. And so her thing was, or in Czech, sorry. So her thing was, she used to eavesdrop on public transport in Prague on the young fellas and the way they'd be kind of throwing linguistic shapes at each other and kind of like playing around and kind of getting one over on each other in the way that they spoke. So she would listen to them and kind of make little notes. I just love that idea. I love this person like kind of like a spy on the tram going. But of course I have no idea how it turned out because I cannot read Czech. I trust her though.
God, yeah, I can only imagine. I know it's you do hear about a lot of Irish novels have been translated abroad, and they decide, well, is Cork the Munich of Ireland, or is it more like the Frankfurt, and having to negotiate these ideas. So I think sometimes when in Hiberno-English, sometimes we try to replace a term that maybe exists in Irish. The one I'm thinking of is how maybe cute whore. I mean, these are two words that are known to English speakers. They have a completely different meaning, and also a third meaning when you actually put them together. And cute in this sense is probably the closest English term to glick. And which is probably the actual type of cleverness being referred to. Whereas but sometimes when you actually take an Irish word wholesale, and I think of this sometimes when an Irish word is just taken as it is, taken in English and just used, and this is something that maybe happens a lot with place names, sometimes the meaning can be lost. It's funny because you're playing with so many different concepts of you're having to communicate the colloquial, you're having to communicate the local, you're having to communicate in two different languages and two different time periods, all within language, which I'd never thought about translation before, but that's like a headache. So I presume Mother Folklore has never been translated, has it? It has not yet been translated. Will it be? I can't imagine it ever could, because the entire every part of the book revolves around making bilingual puns and parts like that. So, and the double meanings, I just can't imagine how you can replicate them in Russian.
But this story of the Czech woman is amazing. But do you think are all your translation experience that good, or do you ever know? Like, would you ever get good feedback if it's an amazing translation, or does that feed back to you from readers?
It's very hard to know, and sometimes it depends on the translator too, because sometimes they don't really want to talk to the author. And some authors don't want to talk to their translators, which I find is the strangest thing. Which is something Teresa, the Czech translator, said to me that when she first emailed me, she was amazed I replied. And I was like, what? How could you write something and have it translated to another language and not be interested to see how that process goes? But some translators, equally, they don't really want that much input from the writer. They want to kind of figure it out themselves. Usually, I kind of, you'd know by the reviews more than the readers, because I don't really know. You know, I have some Italian friends who would say to me, like, oh, that worked really. But they're my friends, of course they'd say that. So if it's reviewed well in the other place, then you kind of know how it went down. But it's just it's a matter of trust, really, and kind of trying to figure out, you know, did the translator, in their interest for it, in their love for it, in all of the questions they asked. In Germany, I have a translator, Werner Lothar Lawrence, and I was very concerned. I had a particular line that had tripped up my Spanish translator, my French translator, and it was the very Hiberno phrase, he hadn't a pick on him, which I think both the French and Spanish translators had originally thought it meant he had no shirt on. Yeah. And I was very concerned about this, so I wrote to Werner and I said, look, when you get to that line, what it actually means is they're saying he's very skinny. And Werner just kind of went, I knew that. I asked my wife and she knew already. So sometimes you can.
That reminds me of a story I mentioned in the book Mother Folklore, that how there was a Japanese visiting lecturer who was talking about Joyce, and how he used in his lecture on the dead. He mentioned there's a point when Greta says, "Oh, I was great with him at the time." She's talking to Michael Cleary in Galway, and the lecturer interpreted this as meaning that she had been pregnant by him, as opposed to that they were just great pals. I was great with him, and obviously that changes the meaning of the story significantly. Yeah,
like there's an Italian friend of mine who was translating my book, which is just a list of basically bloody Irish books, Irish words, loads and loads of Irish words, which he's obviously not going to translate the Irish words, so that's okay. And there's another person in French, in Paris. None of these are like official translations yet, but they look like they're on the cards. I mean, one is halfway through the book. And for me, the thing I'm worried about is not the words, because the Irish words will stay as they are, and then the translation can just be English translation. It was the struggle with trying to get the Irish language is so rooted in the other world, and so clearly there are other languages that are rooted in the other world, but all languages were at one stage. But the modern languages that it's going to tend to get translated in, like your book isn't being translated into Native American dialects or into Mayan or something. You know, it's the modern European languages, and they are all have so much of the divine, so much of the magic squeezed out of them at this stage. So, like, even, people will say, I think I might have even, on your podcast, I might have even talked about this idea of dia, God being in so many parts. Yeah. But we don't understand that dia is the same as Deus, the Latin Deus. So you could say, okay, it's the Roman god. But no, but that Deus is the same as Zeus. It's the same as the Devas in India. This is this ancient god, animistic god that empowered all people. Yeah. So what I would like, whoever's translating my book can translate those Irish words. And I was looking at an Irish audience. And an Irish audience, we instinctively get that. Even if we've forgotten the language, we understand because our grandparents told us, our grandfathers, coming home from the pub drunk and seeing fairies in the field or knowing not to cut. We understand the magic is in the land. But how I am going to get that into the mind of a translator in Frankfurt, that's what frustrates me.
Fairy is a great example of a word that doesn't actually, really correctly match the weight of the Irish term. Like, even people who would take great pride in their atheism and their A1 in biology and in maths would not mess with a fairy fort.
Yeah.
That's me.
Would you mess with the fairy fort?
I don't believe in it at all, but I'm telling you, I'm not crossing those. I'm not going past those crossroads in the middle of the night, and I'm certainly not messing with a fairy fort. You just don't mess with these things.
And that is so, as you say, universal through Irish society, so widespread. It was my bank manager first said to me, he said, oh yeah, I have a bit of land. He said I have a bit of bog, but obviously we can't cut the land. We can't cut the bog and we can't grow on the land. And I said, why? He choices. Well, the bog was always known as it was the ferry's corner, and then the land has a ring fort on it. So I thought, okay, this is my bank manager. And I thought, I'm going to just explore a bit wider. And I decided, okay, so I did it for the Irish Times. I rang up the ESB, I rang up the Law Society of Ireland, I rang up every institution I could think of, the AA, and asked them what their policy was, what their official attitude to the ferries were. Did they believe in them officially? Did they dismiss them? Would they disrespect them? And not one, everyone came back and said, like, I'm not saying I believe or I don't believe, but I'm not going to mess with them. I'm going to keep away from them. And the Roads Authority, you know, they now deny that they went around the ferry bushes building the Ennis bypass, but they clearly did. You look at the road as a big loop, and the engineer would say, no, it was just more practical to do that. Yeah. Right. Like,
you get to see that beautiful sunset at that time of the evening when you're driving that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
Any excuse, but in some ways that in a way pays the great tribute to the she in that by not mentioning them in the law, that shows them the due respect.
That's so powerful, yeah. You know what intrigues me? Like, we're all now getting the highest pixelated cameras, and we're going more and more high res, and we want like the biggest internet to understand the world more deeply. And yet all of those words that brought things alive, like a word like fibine, you know, which is that feeling that when the cattle flight because the gadfly bites them, or a word like branner, which is the lea, a lea field, which we've even forgotten what the word lea is. Lea is an English word, what is a ploughed up field. Like those words that actually focus in on a particular type of element, and we're willing to lose those and go for the bland words, whereas in every other part of our world we want to absolutely control and have high focus on our world. It's like two different things are happening.
Very much so. Manchán, you mentioned you had a passage in respect of place names.
Oh yeah, I do.
Because I think that might tie in nicely with that idea of accuracy.
Yeah, great idea.
Place.
So each place name is like a periscope, offering a view to another world or another era. Carrig na Nonseach in County Waterford means the rock of the foolish women. I could speculate on its meaning, but the mystery of its ambiguity is more appealing. In County Mayo, there's a little inlet in Killery Harbour with a name simply too evocative to even attempt to decipher. Cúnaín Ashford Castle in English, which translates as the little harbour skidding back to hell. So good. It's hard to gauge what gets lost when we can no longer decipher these names. Does it matter that most people in Ballypit Maeve in County Antrim no longer know that they live in the townland of Queen Maeve's vulva, Baile Fitte Maeve? Or that those living in Skeena-Rinky in County Tipperary may not know that their thornbush, Skechin and Rinke, which was ideal for dancing, translates as the little thornbush of dancing? How much value is there in knowing that Lis Far Bug na Gnomon in County Clare derives from Lis Far Biog na Gamon, the fairy fort of the small men of the Hurleys? Or that Loch Derryn de Vodia in County Cork derives from Loch Ghorin an Dá Vo Yeag, the little Oakwood lake of the 12 cows? And what about Cúsrin na Wen Wallig in County Kerry, which derives from Cúsrin an Éan Wallig, the cove of the point of the solitary wrasse? Why was there just one wrasse? And what did this solitary rockfish do to attain immortality in a place name? The truth is that over the course of millennia, we have developed these terms as our own way of relating to our surroundings. Seeing the Stoic promontories that I go on, we saw them as these skulls, these rocky promontories, and we called them Cleggan, the head. And still, you have places like Cleggan. Yeah. The bogland, the sort of the female soft midland area, was a soft place. So was Bugach. It was the womb that kept. That remembered all of our fibrous memories, all of our bog bodies, our butter, our books, even our holy books. And it was the bugach, which gives us the word bog. The esker, esker, an Irish word for those gravel bits. So much of that landscape is in this other language. And, the great example that you all see is you go up and you go to someone in County Antrim, you see it's from Tandragee, and you say, I bet you're really well protected from the wind there in Tandragee. And they say, I am. Like, how did you know? And it's in the word, like Toin the Ragee, backside to the wind. Your house has been built. It's there, but we are getting further away from it.
This is right. And we have so many ahistorical place names, particularly in new housing estates, where you might find something is maybe called Cherry Orchard, and there's never a cherry tree anywhere next or near it. They never even a glacé cherry at Christmas time, and then you find that. And that's something that I think we often the risk of losing these Irish words as lifestyles change is something I'm just thinking as like Ireland has become accidentally and possibly unwillingly the steward of European English. And other English-speaking countries around the world do have their own dictionaries that are kind of regularly updated. I know we have the late Terry Dolan's Hiberno-English dictionary, which was a labour of love and probably a glossary more than compared to say how the Oxford English Dictionary is regularly updated and they have new releases every year or so. You look at how English words like bailout and tribunal have a specific meaning in Ireland that every Irish person understands directly. 30 years' time, someone's doing research on these things, but there's no actual Irish Hiberno-English dictionary to actually directly refer to these things. Someone could say, well, I'm doing some research here on 1990s Ireland. This word tribunal keeps coming up. Why do they care? Is that something to do with shamrocks? Is it something to do with the Holy Trinity? Who knows? But is it time to actually look at, is Hiberno-English something that can ever actually be contained in official, or is in some sort of official record like the Australian Macquarie Dictionary or the Canadian English Dictionary, or is it a fact that it's always going to be this space between Irish and English?
Well, I mean, you put your finger on it when you said that the words go when there's no longer the practices. Yeah. And so, last year I was all looking at C words along the coast, see Tamagotchi, all these words. Yeah. And of course, the people who I got the words from said, I haven't said this word for 40 or 50 years because you're no longer doing those things. Yeah. But I love going to the Museum of Country Life in Castlebar, where basically everything that we used in our lives is there on show, all made out of either straw or wood or leather or some natural fibre. Now, I am sort of obviously a strong eco nut. I love the fact of going back, and here I have my hens and my potatoes and my grass and I'm growing my own cereal. But the fact that maybe these words will become useful, the fact that there's a word for the cloth that you placed under your head to carry a heavy load, just like in Africa, is cochel, or that furchas was the bit of heavy cloth that you used to carry the kettle out of the fire, or that like trussog is a rope, a special type of rope that you put around the hay to carry in your back. Maybe all of these basic labour, rural-based words will come back in an age where we're going to have to be more rooted to the land. I don't know, would anyone welcome that, but possibly.
In our post-apocalyptic society.
Yeah.
God, yeah. So the thought of just having go back to what like parish pumps and what they originally meant and any of that, but that's so before we wrap up, do you have a favourite Hiberno-English word?
Oh God! Well, I've gone on about plomoss now, and I know plomoss is Irish rather than. I also mentioned haunted, which I'm so fond of because it's so specific to Cork. The idea of someone being staff girl, I was haunted. I was really lucky. I mean, like I've never heard that anywhere else in Ireland, and it's just beautiful. That's why I love it.
I've been keeping pigs the last few years, and there's a word for like a little baby pig, and if the sow doesn't have a teat, called cupsy, and it's from cupánach. Basically, you drink out of the saucer, and obviously we know cupán is a cup, but then in Monaghan and in Northern and Westmeath and Cavan, a cupán was actually a saucer. So I love the word. So the saucer becomes the cup as opposed to the cupán, and then that becomes the baby pig, and then you've got a pig called a cupánach or a cupsy. I love all the circles that go around to get to that word.
Absolutely, you can see that there's layers and layers and layers there, and that's and yeah, one of the ones that I always think is that when I go up to Antrim, where my wife is from, they say starving meaning very cold instead of very hungry, and that's something that obviously ties back. Obviously, at one point people were starving and they were freezing as well, but that kept through. So I think, yeah, we'll never get to the bottom of this topic, but it's been lovely to talk to you both about this fascinating area. Lisa McInerney, when is your book out?
It's 13th of May.
13th of May, and it's called?
The Rules of Revelation.
The Rules of Revelation. Manchán Magan, where can people get your book, and what is it called?
32 Words for Field, and Charlie Burns has it in Galway, as well as all the bookshops, and my website has signed copies. They're everywhere. Yeah.
Fantastic. And in Charlie Burns, you can also get my two books, Crack Baby and Mother Folklore, by Darach Ó'Séaghdha, published by Head of Zeus, available everywhere, including Charlie Burns. So, thank you very much.